The Man of Tomorrow, the Golden Stallion, Savzu, the Rated R Radio Star. Pick your names and pick your poison. No, don't pick poison. You never have to pick poison, baby. That's the whole point that we've been getting across on Sovereign Tech for so many years, is you actually don't have to choose the lesser of two evils. But whatever, people still do. Anyway, we got a great Q&A to get into this week. Now, this Q&A is getting released actually a day early, and that's because we're wrapping up more episodes that have to come out on the last day of July, just to have July totally rounded out. I will tell you, so I originally planned, just to give you a little shop talk, there hasn't been an episode of Sovereign Trek, the Star Trek show that I do on Zomia ONE. There hasn't been an episode of that for a couple months. The only reason, I mean, there's scheduling issues that occurred and everything within that, all on me, but the main reason that it didn't happen, what I actually wanted, what I was supposed to get a few days ago, was finally the Blu-ray copy of what we left behind, the Deep Space Nine documentary. And I don't know what the fuck's going on. I know people are actually getting it. I see that on Twitter, that people are actually getting their copies of it, but I have yet to get mine. And it says like there's a problem in transit, but I was supposed to get it on the 25th. I don't know what the fuck the score is there, but I figured that would give everybody that I want involved in the conversation on reviewing that documentary to be on the show and to talk about it. But anyway, you will be getting a lot of Sovereign Trek very soon once we get past that What We Left Behind episode. There's certainly plenty to talk about. Obviously, Ellen and I talked about the Picard trailer on, well, a couple episodes of Sovereign Tech ago. We talked about that and how exciting that was. I mean, there's so much great information coming out about that. It's really something. And boy, let me tell you, does Star Trek need it? Does science fiction, I think, really need it? And I am going to watch this. I mean, there's a bit of a conversation I want to get into here. We have a couple of great questions to get into. One of them is actually a story that has to do with history that I think a lot of people will probably enjoy, because I know a lot of the listeners, especially the hardcore ones that are members of the Zomia ONE Underground, you love it when I start diving into history. So we're going to do a deep dive. But with Picard, now on many episodes of Zomia ONE Underground Q&As, I have. We've talked a lot about entertainment as late. They're the questions that I get in, so I talk about them. And I have been very cynical and honestly just down about entertainment in general. Down as in downer, not as in like, ooh, I'm down for that. No, I mean as in downer. And there's a part of me that, like, Picard is going to have to be a great show, in my opinion, for Star Trek as it is today to stand tall. Now, look, Star Trek's going to be great. Like all the Star Trek that we got before, even the original series, Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, the movies, all that stuff, we're always going to have it, and it's going to be great, and it's going to continue to be great 100 years from now. And I plan on being alive that long, quite frankly. But as far as what's going on right now, Picard is really going to be the decider on, for me, whether or not Star Trek's really going to be worthwhile to continue watching going forward. I'm putting that much on this show because, God damn it, I mean, there's some cool things, especially in the comic books and everything, to talk about with, with Star Trek that could be interesting. But then with comic books don't fall under the same rules, regulations, and requirements that television shows and movies do. I mean, Star Wars falls prey to a lot of my concerns with Star Trek as well, but Star Wars has never really been about, like, it's never been out there to give you, like, a moral message, So Star Wars has always been populist fare, in my opinion. I mean, and I could go back to, when I was a teenager or a young person in the late 80s and early 90s, I never really got picked on for being into Star Wars. That never really happened. Now, if you're into Star Trek, or if you were into Doctor Who back then, or if you were into Battlestar Galactica, again, the 1990s, not 2004. Fuck 2004. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a second here. But Star Wars was the thing that was, like, acceptable. You could be into Star Wars. Star Wars was relatively cool, and I think it's because it wasn't actually, like, really, part of it was that Star Wars, as in the movies, weren't actually really saying anything, right? They were cool. They're great movies. It was the most realistic depictions of, shall we say, action in outer space that we could find. I'm not saying that it was scientifically accurate. I'm just saying that it looked realistic. The effects were that brilliant. But it was okay if you were a fan of Star Wars. But if you're a fan of any other science fiction, oh no, your ass is going to get beat in school. That was how it was. But I say that just to say that Star Wars has always been very populist fare. So for the problem today in entertainment to be that it has to appeal to the lowest common denominator, I mean, Star Wars has always done that. Star Trek never did that, though. And a lot of other science fiction, frankly, never really did that. It was always treated as a niche property. Star Wars amazingly inspired a lot of science fiction to get released, but the studio heads at the time in the late 70s, they didn't know what science fiction was. They just thought it was, okay, explosions in space. And so a lot of creators at the time, and really that would go on for a good 10, almost 20 years, a lot of studios and creators at the time were just like, okay, does it have space explosions in the script? Fine, greenlight it, get it out there, give it a $20, $30 million budget, and let it have its day. And, fortunately, the studio heads didn't know better. Now the studio heads are like, oh, no, we can't put any kind of, you can't put this kind of message in there. You can't actually have the movie have any genuine meaning. Otherwise you're going to offend this group and this group and this group. So you got to make it as, really not blasé, but you need to make it as banal. Sure, it can have a lot of action, but it can be as banal as necessary to make sure that it doesn't offend this group, unless it offends conservatives, and then it's fine. And I understand that. I like offending conservatives too. But regardless, my point in bringing all this up, actually, so like I said, is that we'll see if Star Trek falls under the we need to appeal to the lowest common denominator mantra of Hollywood or not. Picard will really be the decider in that, I really think. But anyway, that's a conversation that really should be had, on Sovereign Trek, and I'm sure that we will. I'm sure Rob and I will talk about it. I'm sure Ellen and I will talk about it at some point, or all three of us, we'll talk about it. That's fine. But anyway, something that I read earlier today, and then we're going to get into a couple of our stories here. Something that I read earlier today was this fascinating. It was by a guy named Bleeding Fool. Now, I don't know if he's just some, anti-SJW asshat, in which case, fuck him, whatever. But he raised some really solid points about the 2004 Battlestar Galactica. And he came up with this phrase, this term, that I think is so on. And the term is a punitive reboot or punitive remake. You insert your word, because those words mean different things for different people. But basically, punitive remake. And his whole theory is that, and look, folks, I get called an SJW, so whatever. I don't care about any of that whole paradigm. Okay. I don't mind, leftist people that are complaining about social issues, they've got a lot of great points. I'm on board, okay? So, and that shouldn't be new to anybody hearing the sound of my voice right now. Racism is an absolutely real thing. And in fact, speaking of that point of racism, so, his concept of the punitive remake, and I'll link to the story if I think of it, but his concept is basically that in Hollywood, you have these SJW types who are wanting to recreate or remake classic shows, but fill it with their messaging. Okay, it's like their way of rewriting history. And I know that there's groups out there that are like, oh, this is what they're doing in college, blah, 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 whatever, ridiculous. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that road. But with entertainment, now it's an interesting thing. Now, but here's the funny thing. Now, while this argument I could see get applied, in fact, he does start to apply it to Star Trek. He starts applying it to Star Wars and all this. And I can kind of see where he's coming from, but then at the same time, I think in a lot of those cases, he's actually off base. I think it's more just that, and you could say this is a reaction to SJW stuff, but I think it's far more just Hollywood execs want to get as many butts in the seats as possible, so you have to dumb down entertainment as much as you possibly can. That's Hollywood's edict. The irony here, though, is that while, and I know I've talked about this on TIE Fighter Renegades with Rob, I know I've talked about this on other shows, the irony here is that while you'd think in general that modern entertainment would in general be more inclusive of various minority groups, go down the list, and that, modern entertainment is more dramatic and blah, blah, blah. The inverse is actually, and more dramatic than, say, shows from yesteryear, certainly shows decades old, right? Because, a show from the 70s couldn't possibly be as socially conscious as a show from the aughts or, the year that we're in now, 2019, etc. The irony is that this writer brings up a really solid point, one that I think unconsciously I was realizing, but I couldn't really put my finger on it exactly. And that is that Battlestar Galactica from 1978 is actually a far more inclusive show than the 2004 Battlestar Galactica. And in fact, the 2004 Battlestar Galactica engages in rampant whitewashing. Rampant whitewashing. It is almost inherently a racist show. I mean, now this guy, like I said, is probably anti-SJW, and I think he's likely just having fun with SJWs, saying, but he does seem to try to be even keel about it. I don't know the guy, but he brought up some really valid points in my opinion. Okay. So I'm not going to, stand up for him or anything here, but regardless, I think he's wanting to have some fun, and because he does end the article off with, go watch the 1978 Battlestar Galactica, and if you don't, you're a racist. And yeah, that's a tough pill to toss out there, right? I mean, and those are tough words to put out there, sure. But his overall point with Battlestar Galactica alone, I mean, the Star Trek and Star Wars stuff, that's a whole other conversation. But his overall point with Battlestar Galactica, I actually thought was fairly sound. In that, I mean, can you think of a main black character from the 2004 Battlestar Galactica? Exactly. In fact, the only minorities you have, of course, you have Edward James Olmos, who's Hispanic, right? I mean, that nice touch. And look, I think Edward James Olmos is a fantastic actor, and I thought his performance was phenomenal. I'm not arguing against that. But then your other, minority character is Boomer, right? She's Asian. However, she's not even human. What a fucking insult is that? And then you take Colonel Ty, you turn him into a white guy, and a white guy, in fact, who, well, I don't know if I want to get into, I don't know if there's spoiler. Is it still possible to spoil that show? Because, I mean, actually, if spoiling the hooks and reveals in the 2004 Battlestar Galactica would keep you from watching the show, I'll spoil it every week, just to keep you from watching that shit show. But anyway, you have all these characters who, they get whitewashed. In fact, I mean, even, honestly, okay, great that Commander Adama is a Hispanic guy in this, even though, they probably weren't necessarily playing him up as Hispanic. But Lorne Greene, who played the original Commander Adama and who was tremendous and phenomenal, I mean, he's a Jewish guy. So basically, you removed Jews, blacks. I mean, you were rampantly whitewashing this show in a very real way, or whitewashing this franchise, I should say, in a very real way. Also, I think that the amount of female lead characters was significantly reduced. You also don't have the, the show is also, the new Battlestar Galactica is also ageist in that you don't really have Boxy, right? I mean, there's real problems here. And to say that, the original Battlestar Galactica, well, but this, I don't know if you want to get into respecting robots and AI or something. I'm sorry. Did I say Boxy? But how about this? I mean, you want to talk about inclusive. Battlestar Galactica A was respecting the robots because of the character of Muffet, right? The robotic Daggett that Boxy gets. But not only that, but fuck, Muffet, actually, there was the one episode, right, where the Galactica is on fire in the original one, and Muffet's the hero of the day. He saves the whole goddamn ship. He saves Boomer. And who's playing Muffet? Who's playing that robotic the robotic Daggett, which is basically the Galactica version of a dog. Who's playing that? It's a chimpanzee. Talk about inclusion. You get that on the new Battlestar Galactica? Fuck no. So I think that there's an irony, and I'll tell you, there's a part of me that really would love to get into, like, because I know that a lot of people who are big fans of that show, a lot of them are certainly more of your leftist types, and I'm not knocking that. I mean, again, I get called a leftist, pun intended, right and left, okay? But there's a part of me that wants to get into, they're more like political liberal faces. And just be like, oh, what, you watch that racist shit? Just have fun with it. But the point is sound, that Ron Moore, basically rode in on a horse like the KKK with Battlestar Galactica. It's, prove me wrong. I mean, really. That I've been saying it for a huge chunk of my life. The original Battlestar Galactica was a show so far ahead of its time. It's amazing. Now, the article that I read about this, and basically saying that Battlestar Galactica was really like it was the vehicle, no pun intended there, it was the vehicle that brought in kind of this modern lack of creativity Hollywood. I mean, I think there's some truth to that, sure. As far as what inspired in the 70s, Galactica to be so incredibly inclusive, to have so many female characters, to have so many, characters of different races and everything on it. Also, it's amazing how great the humans were to all of the alien species that they encountered in the original Battlestar Galactica. Do they even encounter other alien species in the new Battlestar Galactica? Yeah. Where is I going to go with this? All right, everybody being inclusive, or the show being so inclusive. I think the show was so inclusive not because of the studio heads. Understand that, like Star Wars, A New Hope, the original Star Wars, and Rob and I have brought this up on TIE Fighter Renegades many times. George Lucas wanted the entire cast to be black. Like that was the original proposition for the Star Wars back in the 70s. I think, though, Glenn Larson, who created the original Battlestar Galactica, I think the reason that he made it so inclusive really had more to do with his faith. It had more to do with his religion. And that being, at the time, Mormonism, which Glenn Larson was a Mormon, Mormonism was really running into, these kinds of claims where that they were racist, that they wouldn't allow women to have positions of authority, or that black people were shunned, and so on. And I think that was more an edict from the Church of Latter-day Saints than something that came down from Hollywood. That's my theory. That's not in the story that I was just referencing, and I've never really heard anybody say that. But there's a part of me that amazingly, granted, I'm ethnically Jewish. Okay, so, I have some experience. Sadly, it's not just some, but I have experience in what it's like to live, as part of a minority culture, and be surrounded by the majority culture. I knew what it was like to grow up with Christmas and not celebrate it. And it wasn't because I was an atheist. But I think there was a very unconscious part of me that so appreciated, just like I did with the original series of Star Trek, so appreciated having so much representation on, say, the original series of Star Trek and on Battlestar Galactica. And it was fucking rampant, and in a great way. And I wonder if I felt like I could be a part of, because before Babylon 5, before Babylon 5 came out, and like before SG-1 came out, and really, most science fiction went downhill after that, and is continuing to do so. The Matrix came out around then too, so that's still in that that bit of golden era. And boy, talk about a show that's fucking inclusive. No one's going to argue that Babylon 5 was ever fucking racist or anything. Not even close. Oh, I'm sure someone would come up with some kind of case, but you get my point. Before Babylon 5, the original series of Star Trek, and yeah, Next Gen was like a thing, but Kirk was still like the guy, at the time, who also was, a Jewish captain of the ship, just like Lorne Greene was as Commander Adama aboard the original Battlestar Galactica. But those were my two shows. You understand? Like Battlestar Galactica, I loved Buck Rogers as well, but really Battlestar Galactica and the original series of Star Trek, that was my shit. Like I would watch, fortunately, Battlestar Galactica was in syndication, and I would watch and rewatch, episodes of BSG, and I would watch like the Star Trek movies specifically, like over and over and over again all the time. I mean, that was my stuff up until the time that Babylon 5 came on the air. So, and maybe unconsciously, like I appreciated that even as a young person because it felt like I was really included, and I knew as a young person that William Shatner was Jewish and so was Leonard Nimoy. And I knew that, Lorne Greene was Jewish and so on. I mean, that was my stuff. And look, I mean, I don't have to, longtime listeners of Sovereign Tech, I don't have to tell you how much Battlestar Galactica means to me. I did, when Richard Hatch died, I did an entire episode because I had the great honor of effectively becoming his friend. And when he passed away a few years ago, that was heart-wrenching. It's available if you want to listen to that episode. I actually made that public. That's on my YouTube channel where you can find that, the public version of that episode. So anyway, but I read that and I thought that was so fascinating, and how, I mean, it also speaks to, in entertainment, it also speaks to, in shall we say, the mainstream media, the journalistic side of the entertainment industry, how they really do ignore things like, in fact, this was in the documentary for Deep Space Nine, which was, What We Left Behind, where the guy Corrick Lofton, who played Jake Sisko, who played, the kid on that, Captain Sisko's son, where he says, this is, it's so insulting to hear that, this is the first time we've had like major black, like today in 2018 or, anywhere from like 2015 to 2019, that we didn't have like black families on TV and black people weren't represented so much in science fiction and so on. For Star Wars to like make that claim and all of this, I mean, yeah, Deep Space Nine was doing it well before, and frankly, even before Deep Space Nine, I mean, maybe not so much the family aspect of it, but in a very real way, I mean, Battlestar Galactica was way ahead of the curve on that and did it way before Star Wars, even though, credit to George Lucas, he wanted to do it from the get-go, by having, African-American representation in space, quite frankly. And you didn't need, what was his name? Sun Ra, right? The jazz guy, doing his thing, which that shit's awesome. It's so great. Anyway, what was that? Space is the place, right? Holy hell, that stuff's good. That's so good. All right, anyway, so it shows that today, like, everything is marketing, because modern entertainment journalism will give no respect to the bisexual, lesbian, or, pick your race or minority group that has been represented well. And before, mainstream TV, before your regular TV shows and your cop shows were doing it, that they were, that Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek, Babylon 5, go down the list of them, were representing these parts of, humanity long before, anybody was doing it today, long before. And they were doing it very, very well. And the real problem is that, wait, why weren't all the fucking cop shows and everything else on top of that game? That's who you should be insulting. Science fiction should be held up as this beacon of hope for every aspect of the human condition. It really should, and it's not. And it's still not. And in fact, it's almost, I would say, like with Battlestar Galactica, the 2004 Battlestar Galactica being considered like the great science fiction show in recent memory, that is actually setting science fiction decades backwards. Because the show really, just look at it. If you want to argue against like the concept of whitewashing, that's on you. But as far as like the definition of what whitewashing is in Hollywood, that show did it, and it did it in spades, and fuck it for doing so. Because you already had a wildly diverse cast. Battlestar Galactica was way ahead of the curve on that. Way ahead. Decades ahead of the curve. So, anyway. Okay, now that I've said that for about 20 minutes. I want to get into our actual story. I want, I'll tell you, I wanted to get that off my chest. And if I lose people over that, you know what? I mean, I'd much rather you email me and tell me how I'm wrong, or give me the counter argument, and then we can have the conversation, because I want to have the conversation. I want the case made against that. But I mean, it seems pretty true to me. So anyway, here we go. Let's get into this was sent in to me actually via Twitter, and what a story, boy. You want to talk about you want to get into some interesting shit. We're going to get into some interesting shit here. So this is from the site theepochtimes.com, which they have some interesting stories here and there. I mean, I think they're shooting for a lot of clickbait, but this is right on, and this is actually some great writing. So here we go. This is the headline for it. Remains of 9,000-year-old Neolithic settlement unearthed outside Jerusalem. This is from July 17th, 2019. So we're going to talk about this real quick. I had a few people actually send in to me about the bug it's a Linux bug that for Chromebooks, for the Chromebook implementation of Linux. This is what happens when, Chromebooks were rock solid. I mean, what do I have to say about it? Yeah, Chromebooks were rock solid before they implemented Linux. And once you start putting in real code, serious code, and not just like a glorified web browser, you're going to run into bugs, and this is, that's a little bit of a chink in the armor of the security of Chromebooks. But overall, I still applaud Chromebooks having, Linux, in their back end. I mean, it is Linux effectively, but for having it like accessible and usable, and where you can install Linux software and get in the terminal and all that, I still applaud that move overall, and I imagine that a fix will be on the way very, very shortly. So that's all I've got to say about that. Those that asked about that Linux bug in Chromebooks, there you go. But let's get into this 9,000-year-old Neolithic settlement outside of Jerusalem. Read a bit of the story here. A huge Stone Age settlement unearthed outside Jerusalem may have been home to 3,000 people, the Neolithic equivalent of a large city, according to details released by the Israel Antiquities Authority on July 16th. Believed to have been inhabited 9,000 years ago, the site has yielded thousands of tools and ornaments, including arrowheads, figurines, and jewelry. The findings also provide evidence of sophisticated urban planning and farming, which may force experts to rethink the region's early history, said archaeologists involved in the excavation. The discovery was made near the Israeli town of Matzah. Anybody want any soup? Suddenly I just want some soup and holla. Woo! No. But the Israeli town of Matzah, about 3 miles west of Jerusalem, so very close to Jerusalem. Stallion breaking in. That's an important point. We're going to talk about that. Although the area has long been of archaeological interest, excavation director Jacob Vardy said the sheer scale of the site, which measures between 30 and 40 hectares, only emerged in 2015 during surveys for a proposed highway. Of course, who will build the roads? I don't know. Anybody that's willing to just run over our ancient history. I guess that's who will do it. Reading on, archaeologists have since found a large collection of buildings just below the ground surface. As well as private homes, the excavation revealed the remnants of public facilities and spaces used for rituals and burials. All of this is really, really important stuff. In fact, there's a picture here of one of there's a pearl pendant that was discovered on a skeleton at the site. Now, the pendant itself looks like a star, but a 4-pointed star. That, I think, could point at something interesting. No pun intended there. We'll talk about that in a second. Let me keep reading here. Describing the site as the largest of its kind, quote, not just in Israel, but in the southern Levant, end quote, Vardy said in a phone interview that the settlement would have been home to 2,000 and 3,000 people, adding, quote, in comparison to other settlements from that time, it's like a very big city, end quote. The structures suggest that plaster was widely used, while alleyways between buildings point to a comparatively advanced urban planning, Vardy said. Elsewhere, storage sheds were found to have contained legumes such as lentils, implying intensive agriculture at the site. And although the discovery of thousands of arrowheads showed that the inhabitants still hunted, unearthed animal bones also point to sheep husbandry. Basically, they're saying that this was like an agriculturally advanced city for all intents and purposes. and that there was farming going on, etc. Anyway, going on, flint tools, knives, and axes for felling trees were among the various tools uncovered. The site also provides extensive evidence of the inhabitants' production of jewelry and art, with discoveries including, and this is important, including stone bracelets, medallions, bracelets, and figurines. Other unearthed objects suggest that inhabitants enjoyed trade or contact with the outside world. Seashells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea were among the discoveries, as was obsidian, a type of volcanic glass from Anatolia in present-day Turkey. Now, obsidian is an important part of this key. Anyway, I guess we could finish reading up the article, then we'll talk about it. This subheader is rewriting the history books. Large-scale settlements from this period and earlier are known to have existed in the wider region. Archaeological finds at Tel Es Sultan, the ancient city of Jericho, date back to between 10,000 BC and 8,000 BC. Until now, however, the oldest significant remains in Jerusalem were from a 7,000-year-old site recently uncovered in the city's north. The discoveries at Matzah predate these by some 2,000 years. According to Vardy, the newly excavated site may change experts' understanding of life in the region during the latter stages of the Stone Age. In particular, he said it disproves theories that settlements of this size only existed on the other bank of the Jordan River or in the northern Levant region. The claim was that the area, quote, the claim was that the area of Judea and the areas surrounding Jerusalem were empty, that it was a big void, end quote, he said. Quote, there were also claims that during this period, Neolithic societies were in decline and that the villages were becoming smaller. But what we found in Matzah turns a lot of these previous conceptions upside down. The discovery is a real game changer. An area that was supposed to be empty wasn't. It was very vibrant, end quote. Those are all, Stanley breaking in, those are all interesting things to say. And again, I'm going to give you a breakdown on this, on what I think is going on here. Reading on, work on the highway, Jesus, I just about said Jesus Christ, which is actually kind of fitting. You'll understand why. There's a good pun there. But what the fuck? Gotta have those roads, man, History be damned. Reading on. Work on the highway is expected to begin shortly, although the Israel Antiquities Authority said that efforts were being made to document the findings before work commences. Quote, in preparation for the release of the excavated area, the entire site was documented using advanced 3D technology that will enable research of every detail digitally. It is important to know that significant percentages of the prehistoric site around the excavation are preserved, end quote. Now, I actually imagine that that's true. Why we feel like we just constantly have to run roads through shit, I don't understand. Or no, I do understand it. I'm just saying that it's might be, frankly, downright wrong. But regardless of all that, let's talk about this settlement near Matzah. Is this where matzo balls came from? No. I'm kidding about that. Let me tell you something. Matzo ball soup. I hadn't had matzo ball soup in so long. When I first moved to New Hampshire, so this was almost 8 years ago now. I haven't had them in so long. Would you believe it? I'll tell you, I got to tell you this, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying, but Ellen makes the most amazing matzo ball soup I've ever had in my life. And you got to understand, I come from a family on both sides. It's Jews all around, and I have never tasted matzo ball soup that fucking good. Boy, is it amazing. We have a good time with that matzo ball soup. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. And she's laughing now, so good. She doesn't mind me saying it. All right, so this find of a city, and what is effectively a city, or, town, that's all kind of relative, right? Because 3,000 people today would not be considered a city. That'd probably be considered a home today. I don't know. But anyway, we'll call it a city. This is very interesting. And it's interesting because when I started reading the story about this, and I thank the gal who sent this in, she's always sent great stuff into the show. When I started reading about it, the very first thing that came to mind for me was Salem. Now, I don't mean Salem, Oregon, or whatever. Salem, and if you read in Genesis chapter 14 in Torah, you read about this character. Basically, this whole incident goes down with Abraham, and he has to effectively go to war. He needs to, refresh his people, though, some odd 300 people, whatever. He ends up going to, and after getting the spoils of this attack and everything, he ends up going to a holy site to go meet with a priest. The priest's name is Melchizedek. There's a lot to say around that. But Melchizedek lives in a city or town or area called Salem. Now, it makes a ton of sense in the world to assume that this is a proto version of Jerusalem, the city of peace. And Melchizedek itself is a name and a priest referenced a couple other times at least in the Bible. In Torah, in the book of Psalms, he's referenced. Depends on what version you happen to read. But also, is it the book of Hebrews, where that's in the New Testament, where Paul calls Christ a priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is a pretty important thing actually to say, because Melchizedek's inclusion in Torah is giving you this. It's giving you. What's the word that I'm looking for here? It's giving you a priestly line. It's giving you kind of, authority going back. It's giving you lineage. That's the word I'm looking for. It's giving you lineage. Okay. Now, as far as who is this Melchizedek guy in Torah or in Genesis 14, you have a lot of rabbis who, and we're talking rabbis from back in the day, which, in the main rabbinic period between, say, 250 BCE to the 6th century, okay, CE, that they would argue that he was actually Shem, okay, and understand that rabbis from this time, okay, that they were, they're not just your everyday rabbi that you meet at synagogue if you went there today, okay, this is what's known as the Chazal period, or the Chazal period, if you want to go really fancy with it, okay, or the Chazalic period. And so, rabbis at this time, they are referenced back and are considered part of what is known as Talmud Torah. So their commentary isn't something that you just take lightly. It's not just what your pastor thinks, okay, if you were to put this in Christian terms. And they claim that Melchizedek is Shem, as in the son of Noah, one of the still holy sons of Noah, unlike Ham. And Shem, so the idea is that Abraham actually went to go meet Shem and get a blessing and, get everybody refreshed from Shem, who was running things in Salem. Now, there's big arguments around Salem that actually that area of Canaan would be, nobody really argues that Salem is some kind of progenitor to the city of Jerusalem that, Moses or, that the Israelites were eventually led to, right, coming out of Egypt. Nobody really argues about that, but as far as who is in charge of Salem, there are some arguments about that in the Talmud, because, they're saying, no, actually, this is an area that belonged to Ham, so what would Shem be doing there? And, Shem actually, came there to do his priestly shit and whatever. Anyway, that gets into a big conversation. But Melchizedek himself, this idea that it was Shem, there's other interpretations as well. There are people who say that he was actually the Archangel Michael, or that the Archangel Michael is actually a proto-version of Jesus Christ, and so Melchizedek is actually Jesus Christ, which would make sense why in the book of Hebrews that, Paul, the Apostle Paul, would say that Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, because he actually was Melchizedek. So you get into, that kind of conversation and everything. I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of the character of Melchizedek. But the idea that this 9,000-year-old city could actually be Salem, I think that's what came to mind for me when I read this, is that this is actually Salem. And this was a proto-version of what would later on become Jerusalem. I'm tossing that theory out. Of course, you can get into other theories, you can get into what the Samaritans have put in their own, holy books. Wow. Whenever I bring this stuff up, there's so much I want to tell you. But the Samaritan books like the Samaritan version, effectively, of the Pentateuch, okay, of the 5 books of Moses, there are some interesting differences in that. And in fact, they do reference where Salem would be in a completely different spot than what you think where Jerusalem would be. It wouldn't be near Matzah, but the idea that actually where the temple should be built and where, the priesthood should reside, the idea that that's up to some debate that's a thing. That's the whole reason that I bring this up to you. So the idea that this is like some kind of advanced city, there is agriculture going on there, which is exactly what Abraham would have had to run to, would have gone to, something that where his men could get fed, where, there could be a priesthood surviving and all this. And we know that there's buildings here, right, in this ancient site near Matzah that was designed for ritualistic use, does kind of lead to the idea that, there was a priesthood there of some kind, or something that relates to a priesthood, that maybe this is where this character of Melchizedek comes from. Now, let's talk about Melchizedek itself, okay? And, oh man, like, it was interesting that one of the pendants that they find, like that pearl pendant, was of a star, because that kind of points at a connection to Ishtar, because Ishtar's star was the 4-pointed star, but is actually 2 of them, and where it looks like an 8-pointed star, more so. But there's really a lot of different ways that this could go. Melchizedek, now in the name Melchizedek, which I think that means like priest of righteousness, something like, or king of righteousness is what Melchizedek stands for, which is also why a lot of people want to point at him being Jesus Christ. The name Zedek at the end, which there are other points where there are Hebrew names with, like, there's a king who has Zedek in his name and so on. Zedek is very close to the name of a Canaanite god, okay? And there is the theory that, basically Elohim, or, Adonai, well, whatever name for God that you want to choose, but basically that the Hebrew God was really just some kind of volcano god. In fact, like the Book of Urantia talks about this, not that you need to give the Book of Urantia any credence, but there are plenty of people who talk about that really the god, the Hebrew God is basically just a Canaanite volcano god mixed in maybe with some stuff that the Israelites learned in Egypt. Okay, so Zedek, which would put it, kind of a pre-Egyptian version of this. Okay, so Zedek being this, and again, they found obsidian, right? Obsidian was part of the findings there, which, is a byproduct of a volcanic area. The idea that this could be Salem, where Melchizedek lived, and that they effectively worship some kind of volcano god, there's something that could point at that. You're going to hear from me here that there are a lot of different interpretations possible of what this is, but a part of me really, again, it was amazing when I was reading everything listed off here, that it really smacked, like I just instantly thought that, oh no, this is probably the ancient city of Salem that perhaps Abraham went to. Now, you run into other problems with that, though, because someone that I'm actually quite a fan of is the works of Ahmed Osman, who is an archaeologist, Egyptian-born archaeologist, author. Maybe the mainstream archaeology community doesn't want to call him an archaeologist, but whatever. He's written quite a few books, actually, and some of them I've made available. Like, I've gotten scanned because they're not available in ebooks. Wonder why. But anyway, his first book that came out back in '87 was one called Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, which I think is a rock-solid... it's a brilliant book that, and I know that there have been other archaeologists that have tried to argue against it, but I just think it's one of those solid pieces of archaeology and of interpretation that you look at it and you go, holy fuck, this guy might be right. But here's the rub, is that one of the main conclusions of Stranger in the Valley of the Kings by Ahmed Osman is that Joseph, okay, the character of Joseph, coat of many colors, all this, right, was actually the guy who ended up, who started the entire Hebrew populace in Egypt, according to Torah, that he was actually the father-in-law of Amenhotep III, a guy named Yuya. Now, the importance of that is that Amenhotep III, you're like, that sounds kind of familiar, but who is that? Amenhotep III is the father of Amenhotep IV. Now, maybe you're like, Amenhotep IV, wait, who's that? I feel like I've heard the Golden Stallion talk about Amenhotep IV before. Amenhotep IV is just another name, and the original name for Akhenaten, the guy who would end up completely rebranding and reforming the religion in ancient Egypt. This is the guy who would make everybody worship the Aten. This is the guy that a lot of people point at as the originator of the idea of monotheism, which of course, then most people say, well, the most successful or the biggest monotheistic religion in history would be Judaism. Now, Ahmed Osman would go farther, and he wouldn't be the only one, because you would have Jewish commentators in 2,000 years ago, like, say, Josephus, who wrote War of the Jews, Antiquities of the Jews, and so on, would also make the claim that Moses was actually like an Egyptian character. I think so Josephus would actually say that Moses was a character named Osarseph, who, taught Akhenaten, but, and would then basically, that's where Akhenaten got the idea of a monotheistic Egyptian religion, is because he was basing it off of the Hebrew faith, that Moses taught him. But Ahmed Osman will actually go a bit further, and Ahmed Osman claims that Moses himself was actually Akhenaten. Or, was actually, it was Akhenaten, not Amenhotep. Whew, so many names. But that's what Ahmed Osman would say. And actually, Ahmed Osman would go really, really far, and would go even further than that, and would say that a lot of the stories in the Bible, and I don't just mean Torah, I don't just mean the Old Testament, I mean the New Testament as well, that a lot of these stories were really just retellings and rebrandings of Egyptian history. In fact, even the character of Jesus, who his actual Hebrew name was Yeshua, right? Joshua. That Joshua, who took over after Moses died, that Joshua of the Old Testament and Jesus of the New Testament are actually the same person. They're the same character. And just somebody fucked it up, at some point. That they're maybe even in the 16th century, that there was this major fuck up, or that they were basing it off of. And this gets into another very interesting theory, that Christianity, while he would argue that basically, Ahmed Osman actually has an entire book on it, that Christianity is really just a reformulation of an Egyptian mystery cult. There's another great book out there, and the title is escaping me, but basically it suggests, and the evidence is pretty good, that Julius Caesar actually invented Christianity, and he invented it as a religion to pacify the Roman populace, so that he could, continue on and actually become, king. He could become emperor of the world, right? Because that, et tu, Brute, there's a reason that there's a reason that Julius Caesar, ends up getting offed, and that's because he was, he was becoming something that the Romans thought was, was anathema to them. The idea of being ruled by one man, the idea of being ruled by a king. And so the idea that Julius Caesar actually created Christianity. Now, the thing is that, the theory goes on that Julius Caesar would actually have, or the melding of these theories would be that Julius Caesar actually borrowed this mystery cult religion from Egypt, turned it into Christianity, used it to pacify the people. Whether or not that worked very well, that depends on how you want to interpret how well, or whether something is good or bad. But then the idea of this, Messiah that, died and came back to life and all this was actually just, again, it had already happened. Okay, it had already happened during the time of ancient Egypt, where you had the character of Joshua, who took over for Moses. Moses was actually Akhenaten, and, Joshua was the successor to Akhenaten, and that, again, this Jesus character is a later creation, or the idea that all of that happened much later on is a later creation. And the idea that, most people don't have a problem, even the most ardent of, Christ deniers, do you want to call them that? I don't know. The people that say that Christ never actually existed, most people admit, at the very least, of the people that are talked about and mentioned in the New Testament, that the Apostle Paul was a real person. There's debate over who Paul originally was before he was Paul. Like some people say, no, actually, he could have never been Saul, who was, persecuting Christians. Paul was somebody else, whatever. But Paul was a real person. And I actually have no problem believing. I mean, there can be debates around whether or not Jesus actually existed. But the idea that Paul existed, Paul interacted with other Romans of his day, famous Roman writers, Seneca and so on. Okay, so the idea that Paul existed, I think, is very, very true. But also those same people who would say, yeah, Jesus probably didn't exist. Paul most likely did, but they would also come to the conclusion that Paul was insane. Like that Paul was like, literally, he was nuts, and he just wrote wacky shit. And keep in mind that Paul really, the New Testament, which is all supposed to be about Jesus, there's really only 4 books, and 3 out of those 4 seem to all be based off of a different, a certain source document, which you can get into, like the Gospel of Q, which people talk about and all that. That's another conversation. But the bulk of, there's other writers as well, not just Paul, but the bulk of the New Testament was written by the Apostle Paul. Now, did he put together the entire New Testament? Most likely not. And, what would end up becoming the New Testament wouldn't get codified, and collected as a canon until, a good couple hundred years or more after Paul was, long gone. We're talking about the Council of Nicaea. Okay. So I bring this up to suggest that Paul really could have created, and he was creating churches all throughout Rome, or the Roman Empire, and he could have convinced people through his own zealousness that there was this guy, Jesus, who lived at such and such a time, and he was actually, he lived whatever, 10 years ago or something like that, whatever, or, well, Paul, these are such huge subjects, and I'm trying to, encapsulate all this, because Paul takes over, after Jesus dies, right? Jesus lives for supposedly 33 and a half years, and then Paul takes over. Anyway, Paul is like, well, this guy existed up until this point, and, it is interesting that Paul doesn't enter the picture until Jesus dies, right? And they in fact, even some Christian groups, they interpret like the prophecy, what was that? The prophecy of however many weeks, the 70 weeks, right? They actually interpret that as the last, because each week is actually based off of a prophetic day, so it's so many years, and Paul picks up on one of the weeks that is prophetically about Jesus Christ's ministry, which starts at when Jesus turns 30. See how confusing this is? Anyway, so Paul takes over as soon as Christ is gone, which is awfully convenient. And so the idea is that Paul is this guy that actually espouses the notion that there was this character of Jesus that lived in the 1st century CE, when in reality, Jesus, all these stories about Jesus are really about this character of Joshua that Julius Caesar actually borrowed. I know it's confusing, but that he pulled from an Egyptian mystery cult that he used to actually try and pacify the people, and also, not just the people, but to pacify the Jews as well, which, there were, at that time, in the first, around that time, you were having ruminations, and certainly plenty of attempts at Jewish revolts. So the idea that basically that Ahmed Osman forwards, that really everything within Christianity and even Judaism is really rebranding of Egyptian history. I'll say it, it's not so crazy. It's really not. And the idea that there was, even like that this city that we're talking about in Matzah, that, that could be Salem, and that Salem in this area, the southern Levant, still has some importance in Egyptian history. That still fits certain bills as well. Okay, once you get into, this history of this character of Abraham, which understand that, this city is around 9,000 years old. Okay, as far as when it went out of favor, and when the events all happened with Abraham, because the events of Abraham right now, understand this with Abraham, that those events, people argue when if Abraham was a real person, when all that even happened. And they argue between, and this is a big problem for archaeologists, because they're arguing around a span of 300 years. It's one thing to be, 20 to 50 years off the mark, but they argue between whether it's 2100 or 1800 BCE. They don't know, when exactly that this happened. I mean, and to have a, lead time, or, to have a span of 300 years when these events could have happened, I mean, you might as well just guess any time. And so anyway, so this idea that this is Salem, this is like a proto-Jerusalem, I think that makes a lot of sense. Could that lead to a time frame when, like, maybe the story of Abraham was actually happening? Because again, everything that I'm talking about with Ahmed Osman and what he has to say picks up with the story of Joseph, which we don't really debate when exactly around that could have been. Okay, because we have a pretty good idea of the Pharaoh, who Joseph was working for, etc. But, to suggest that, I mean, again, what happened during the Amarna period, which is when Akhenaten was running the show and making these, what to everybody in Egypt thought were just these like crazy resolutions and frankly religious revolutions. After that happened and Akhenaten and his ilk were basically chased out of Dodge, or in this case, Amarna, were chased out of Egypt. I mean, for them to run off to some ancient place where the old religion that Akhenaten was basically taught by perhaps his father, and in that case his grandfather, who would have been Joseph, for them to run back to the old town, which would have been, effectively they were heading towards Jerusalem, and for there to be this town that is more ancient than Egypt, I mean, that kind of fits a bill there, with this idea of it being Salem. Okay, it really does, in my opinion. So I think this adds into perhaps what is more the real history. And folks, I've brought this point up so many times. You have to understand that Torah, the books of Moses, that's one animal, right? That's the Pentateuch, okay, those 5 books. Things after that, okay, even like, the book of Judges and some other stuff, and the book of Joshua, the book that would be attached in this theory that I'm laying out to you. But things that happen after that, some of that could have been very real history with people who absolutely identified themselves as Jews. Okay, but even in that history, you have where, again, Hilkiah the priest, he finds what is apparently the book of Deuteronomy, right? He finds that. The Jews who were building the second temple, or the Jews of the time of King Josiah, or the Hebrews, Israelites, go down the list of what you want to call them, they lost their history. They didn't know. I mean, and it's right in Torah itself that Torah had been basically lost. And so the idea that somehow they just gleaned and used like ancient Egyptian history or Babylonian, which could be tied into that as well, that they use that history to fill in the gaps in their own history. I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. Yeah, it's one of the biggest problems in the Bible in its entirety is that there's a point where it admits it lost its history, it lost itself. And you never hear that they actually found the entire Pentateuch. We assume they found the book of the law, that they found Deuteronomy. That's generally what's accepted by rabbis and others that, that research, that moment in history. So it's not so crazy that everything you find out, before like, I don't know, maybe the time of, Solomon, I don't even want to say before the time of Solomon, but basically before the time of, King Josiah, that all of that history is up for grabs. It could all be a farce. It could have all been made up or just like rebranded and rewritten history that was actually Egyptian history and not really something of these characters known as the Hebrews. Okay, and I mean, there's a couple of great books out there that totally break down the idea that the Jews or the Hebrews were actually, a pharaonic dynasty in Egypt. That they were Egyptians for all intents and purposes. Because Egypt, keep in mind also, Egypt was an empire. It wasn't just one people. Okay, it was a group of people. And could whatever the Hebrew spawn came out of be one of those peoples? Absolutely. Like, there's no reason for that not to be true. Like, there was that documentary, what was it, The Exodus Decoded, where that guy, like, broke down this whole thing of trying to find, wait, where did the events, like, where is this, this moment where the Israelites are kicked out of, or the Hebrews or whatever, are kicked out of Egypt? Where did this happen? Because we have no mention of it in Egyptian history. Now, his theory is that it's actually that the Israelites historically were written down as a different people, a people called the Hyksos, who do get banished from Egypt. But I think, but there's a problem there, and it runs into the same problem that Abraham ran into, right? Is that the documentarian, he basically had to, like, adjust the clock of when the events of Exodus happened by 150 years. And basically any archaeologist will tell you, you can't do that. Not when you actually have pretty good evidence as to, okay, no, this was Ramses III and blah, blah, blah. Like, you can't just shift it back to 150 years that's when that happened. That's his argument. Now, when I do that with, say, the character of Abraham, well, again, there's already the problem of we don't know when the events with Abraham actually happened. It's a lot of guesswork, and it's a time frame of 300 years. So archaeologists are already dealing in a wild span of time. As to where, arguably, when the events of Moses, of the Exodus, happened, no, there's a pretty good idea when exactly that occurred. And so to play the game of going back 150 years, in that case, when you have good evidence, or, evidence that fits the story, then, yeah, no, like that doesn't work. However, if it was really all just Egyptian stories, then we know exactly when, and we have the moment when, Akhenaten's priesthood and everybody else, ends up getting kicked out, right? And that actually, well, anyway, this gets into big stuff. I know I keep saying that, but you cannot imagine the amount of history I'd have to tell you, and lay out to explain all this. I'm trying to make it, like, as succinct as I possibly can. Now, the first critique that I know is going to come up with what I'm telling you is that, or what I'm suggesting, I should say, what I'm suggesting to you is that one of the guys I referenced, that being Josephus, who was a Jew, Flavius Josephus, he was from the 1st century, he was a Roman, but a Jew, and he wrote books that are oft quoted as far as, Jewish history goes, Antiquities of the Jews, War of the Jews, and so on. Now, what some of you are going to say, wait, you're suggesting that Jesus might not have been a real person. But then Josephus is, and this is important, Josephus is the only independent, unless you want to count some certain little comments out of the Talmud, which that gets into another conversation. But he's the only independent source that mentions that a person named Jesus even lived at that time, and it was a person that performed miracles. It's true that Josephus mentions that, but it is heavily, heavily debated whether or not that verse, or that part of Josephus's writings was actually something that Josephus wrote, because it's like just an out of nowhere inclusion. Right? I mean, it is absolutely out of nowhere that suddenly he just, this one little line that mentions Jesus, and then he just goes along his way. And I mean, you run into a lot of problems with the Gospels to that, right? Like, there's the special resurrection. Jesus wasn't the only one that came back from the dead. There were actually lots of people who came back from the dead, and they were all praising Jesus' name. And Josephus, and in fact, nobody talked about the fact that suddenly there were zombies everywhere. I mean, what is that, Matthew 23, where that's talked about? I mean, it's very odd. It's one thing, okay, one guy supposedly comes back from the dead or whatever. Fine, maybe people wouldn't write about that. But when suddenly there's a ton of people rising from the dead, the graves are rolling over, I mean, and nobody else writes about this? Talk about tough pills. That is a tough pill to swallow. Again, that's called the special resurrection. You can look into it. And everybody wants to ignore it because they run into the problem that, wait, how did nobody else talk about that? The idea that Josephus, knew about a character named Jesus who performed miracles, yeah. I mean, just that one line and to not spend any other time on it, another tough pill. But regardless of all of that, if you want to know what I thought of this 9,000-year-old city found near Matzah, that's what came to mind for me. Okay, and all of that, who Melchizedek was, and all of this. Was Melchizedek Shem? I don't think I got to who I think Melchizedek even was. Was Melchizedek Shem? I mean, when I was a Christian, that's basically what I thought, and that was, well, in Christianity, in some forms of Christianity, you have this concept of the types of Christ. And so it could be Shem while still representative very much of Christ. Could have been that at the same time. Is it still Shem? Is it still somebody who is a survivor of a flood event? Frankly, it would fit a certain timeline, say for Epic of Gilgamesh and so on. So who knows? Again, it's a city that seems fairly advanced. It was designed. It was urbanly, there was urban planning involved. There was advanced agriculture happening there. There was some kind of ritualistic practices, and there were buildings designed for it. This is not cave people, okay? It's the Neolithic. It's people coming out of the later Stone Age, maybe, okay? But, well, not maybe. I mean, it is. But that doesn't mean that they were, unintelligent or not advanced in certain ways. There seems to be a large degree of social advancement at this place, near Matzah. And because of its closeness, extreme closeness, and age to Jerusalem, it makes me wonder if it wasn't something to do, with that. I mean, if Abraham is a real person, his history definitely happened in the Levant. I don't think that happened in Egypt. Okay, but that gets into a much larger conversation. But that's what came up for me as far as what this is. And some of that jewelry, in fact, also, the fact that the jewelry, granted at the time, metalwork probably, in a mainstream context, metalwork wouldn't have been happening anyway. So having stone jewelry and all that, of course, makes sense. But, when you read Exodus, and there's the point where when they're going through the desert, you have the situation with the golden calf, and where, depending upon what translation you read of the Hebrew text, the idea that Aaron and Moses, or, well, perhaps Moses was Akhenaten, that they were eschewing what the Egyptians did, and that is having jewelry and makeup and all this other stuff. The idea that this place that could be Salem would have more simple jewelry, and in fact, I would argue jewelry that would point at maybe some kind of connection with Ishtar. Again, that's another story. I think that's very interesting, and I think that adds into quite a bit to my theory. So that this might have been the original location of Salem. So there you go. That's what I got, and maybe that there was some kind of could there have been some great temple there, or something like that. There were clearly ritualistic places there. Whether or not it was some great temple, that's a whole other conversation. And actually, that, the Temple of Solomon and so on, as far as where that actually was, that's a whole other conversation to have. In fact, there's a place that I think it happened to be, and I think that it all got moved in the 19th century, but I'm going to have to save that for another time, and you're going to have to ask me about it if you want to know. So, all right, this has been going long, but, it's an interesting conversation to have, and I hope I give you a lot of food for thought. Look, I know I have religious people. I have Christians. I have Jews. Actually, I know I have, Muslims, people who practice the Islamic faith, who listen to my Q&As, who listen to my shows. Take all this for what you will. I am putting it out there. I've, over the years, I'm going to bring this up, over the years, I have lost subscribers. In fact, people who were patrons to, because of the fact that they became Eastern Orthodox, or they became this or whatever, and they basically said, well, I can't support your show because now I am of this church or something like that. I am literally the most peaceful guy you will ever meet. And part of the reason I say that is that I know there's people out there, but I've yet to meet another person who is absolutely unwilling to take another human life. I meet some, and they're people that I've talked to, and I think, maybe I've helped convince them or whatever. But it is so rare that I run into those other people, and I sure as fuck don't run into them in Christian churches. And I don't run into them in other faiths either, Jews or otherwise. I am one of the most peaceful guys you are ever going to meet in your life. And the idea that somehow, like, I am an evil person, even though I'll say great Satan or hail Satan or whatever and all this stuff, the idea that I am an evil, I mean, that blows my mind when I get that kind of feedback from people. Yeah, I'm reminded, like, when Gandhi, that classic quote from Gandhi, where he's like, Christians, I like your Christ, but I don't like Christians because you're nothing like your Christ. And I'm not saying I'm like Christ. I'm just saying I espouse complete peace. And the idea that somehow I am some unethical guy that is putting out some kind of evil message. Hate to put it in these words, but you're killing me. You're killing me. Are you serious? Yeah, those words from Gandhi. Anyway, so I'm just putting this stuff out there, and I guess if you want to take that as the word of Satan, go for it. What am I going to do? How could I possibly change your mind on that? So, in fact, just to bolster the point that we can have a conversation and I can actually respect you, my album of the week this week is actually from a Christian, a guy that I have a ton of respect for. I'm a huge fan of, and who, has espoused Christianity for a long, long time. And that is none other than Creed's frontman, Scott Stapp, who I'm a huge fan of. And I love his music, and I know some of it is definitely laced with Christian lyrics, especially his solo work. And he just had a new solo album come out about a week ago in July 2019, and this album is fucking awesome. And I don't care if he's singing about Christ or he's singing about whatever. Great music's great fucking music. I listen to Skillet, I listen to Stryper, I listen to all these guys. I don't give a rat's shit. It's amazing that road, that street doesn't seem to go two ways. Problem with roads, I guess. Anyway, so Scott Stapp's new album, The Space Between the Shadows, fucking great album. I mean, it's not like, if I were to give it out of 10, I'm not going to give it a 10 out of 10, but I'll give it a good solid 7 or 8 out of 10. I think it's fantastic. It's certainly better than his sophomore album. Was that Proof of Life? His first album, The Great Divide, I give a 10 out of 10. I think The Great Divide is a masterpiece of an album. I also like the song that he did for the movie The Passion, Relearn Love. Fantastic song. His second album I thought was a very weak outing, but this album, I don't want to say it's a return to form, but fuck is it some great Scott Stapp. And he doesn't get too much into the kind of like crooning sound. He's very much dropped that in this. But there's a lead single off of it, which is Purpose for Pain. Listen to this song. This song is so badass. I love it. I love it. It's worth the album alone. But there's other great tracks on here too. World I Used to Know, Name, Heaven and Me, Face of the Sun, Red Clouds. Red Clouds is a great song on this. Love Red Clouds. So there's a good 4 or 5 tracks on this that I think are really, really solid. Purpose for Pain is a great song. If I were to rate that as a song alone, I'd give it a 10 out of 10. Lots of energy, really emotional stuff. I mean, hard rocker, I dig it. So yeah, if you want to check out last week we did Sabaton, but you want to this came out the same day actually. Scott Stapp, The Space Between the Shadows for 2019. This is a totally worthwhile listen. Check it out. Trust me, I really don't think you'll be disappointed with this. Anyway, so I'm going to wrap that up, and there I gave him his due. He'd probably say I'm ridiculous for what I had to say through a lot of this, but whatever, I can respect people. Imagine that. And I bought the single Purpose for Pain when it came out, and I paid for this album. I put my money where my mouth was. Can people of his faith do the same? And I know many of you can, because you're still listening to me. So anyway, there we go. We'll wrap this baby up. And again, this is just coming out because we have a lot to come out on Wednesday. And with August, I am hoping that August will pick up a lot of episodes that I need to make up for that I started recording actually in July, and we'll get them out there. So anyway, lots of content to come out on Zomia One, lots of content to come out for Zomia One Underground members, and because a lot of it we did release throughout July, but there's more to come. I will see all of you on the other side.